Hey everyone, welcome back. We are going to continue our conversation about biological psychology. We've talked a little bit about neurons. Today, we are going to dive into the brain, the most complicated organ of our body. We'll do what we can to try to simplify some of these structures so that they make sense to everyone. Here it is. Here's your brain. It regulates our nervous system. It allows us to do just about everything, right? It allows us to experience sensations and interpret perceptions. It allows us to think critically and have memories. It's in charge. It's 3 pounds. It's in our skull. It's got two hemispheres there, the left and the right hemisphere. We'll talk at a later lecture about some of the differences between those hemispheres, but you don't need to worry too much about that today. Let's break the brain down into some main divisions or some main parts. And just like in our memory notes, you might remember it's good to chunk this information out and maybe study it in little bits and pieces, because by the time we're done with this unit, you are going to hear about close to 30 different parts of the brain. So let's go through some of these different divisions. Today, we'll talk about the hindbrain and some subcortical structures. Our next lecture will be about the cortex. So let's take a look at the hindbrain first. All right, hindbrain, what is it? Well, if you look at this diagram of the brain on the bottom, the one kind of on the bottom left, the structures that are highlighted in yellow there, that makes up your hindbrain. Speaking from an evolutionary standpoint, it is the oldest part of our brain, and it is also the most similar to all species. Like the hindbrain of a human is actually really similar to the hindbrain of a chimpanzee, a house cat, heck, even a goldfish. Our hindbrains are really, really similar. And it makes sense because of the type of things that our hindbrain does. Well, one part of our hindbrain is called the medulla, and you can see it there. The medulla is at the very top of the spinal cord or the bottom of the brain stem. It's not part of the spinal cord. It's essentially the first thing that you would run into. The medulla is in charge of a couple of really important things: breathing and heart rate. And so if you damage your medulla, you're in big trouble. Like, best case scenario, you're in a coma. More likely, you're dead. Your medulla keeps you alive, helps regulate breathing and heart rate and things like that. And then right above the medulla, you see this little lump here. Those are called your pons. And your pons help regulate sleep. And so when you get really tired at night, or when you're feeling really energized, perhaps around 10 or 11 in the morning, those are your pons. Your pons help regulate your sleep cycle. Traveling along the inside of your brainstem is your reticular formation. And to really see this, you should look at this image on the right hand side, and you can see this band of nerve fibers that travels up the brainstem. This kind of pink thing is your brainstem right here. That's your reticular formation along the innermost side. And your reticular formation helps with alertness. For example, if you're feeling kind of drowsy and then someone says your name and like your ears kind of perk up, you're like, oh, hey, what do you need? That's your reticular formation. It brings you into alert. You could have a lab rat, for example, that is in very, very deep sleep. And if we stimulate their reticular formation, they are wide awake, ready to go immediately. And if you were to damage your reticular formation, again, you'd go into a coma, right? You would not be able to be alerted to any type of arousal. And then behind the brainstem is this structure of the brain that it actually kind of looks like a brain itself, and it's what we call the cerebellum. Should sound familiar because we talked about it in our last unit in memory. Cerebellum, it helps with big movements. It helps with posture, standing upright, walking around, keeping our balance. Those big implicit memories, right? Gross motor control, that's your cerebellum. So if you look at those structures, if you think about what they do, what they're responsible for, it kind of makes sense how those structures are really similar, whether or not you're a human or you're a horse, right? We still need our heart to beat, our lungs to help us breathe. We need to know when to wake up, how to be alert or when to be alert, and we need to have some nice posture and balance as we're walking around. So that's our hindbrain. Now I'm going to back up just a second. You'll see that we also have the subcortical structures and the cerebral cortex. Well, if you look at this word cortex and then go back up to subcortical, well, sub means below, right? So we have our hindbrain, and you can see our hindbrain right here. Here's our brain stem. Here's our cerebellum. Our cortex is along the top, and so these subcortical structures will be beneath the cortex. So let's talk a little bit about these subcortical structures. The subcortical structures are going to be all these different parts kind of on the inner part of our brain. So I'm just going to go along this list here. I'll go relatively quick, and you can email me a question or ask in class if you have them. So the first one, the hippocampus, again, it's review. We talked about the hippocampus when we talked in our memory unit. It helps form explicit memories. I have their memory in your notes. You should probably be a little bit more detailed. It's not just memory, it is the formation of explicit memories. Okay, next to the hippocampus, if we look at our little chart there of the brain, or our graphic of the brain, we have what's called the amygdala. And the amygdala helps us with controlling our emotions, really strong emotions. Things like anger and aggression are housed within our amygdala. If you were to stimulate the amygdala of a lab rat, it would become incredibly violent and aggressive. If you were to remove the amygdala of a lab rat, it'd become incredibly kind of calm and docile and not easily excitable. So our amygdala helps regulate these really strong emotions. You can think the A in amygdala, think A in anger, A in aggression. Stumbling over my words here. Next to that, we have the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus helps with internal drives. It helps with maintaining homeostasis. And so things like body temperature, right? You likely have an internal body temperature somewhere right around 98.6 degrees. Your hypothalamus helps maintain that particular body temperature. If you start to feel really hungry, it's your hypothalamus that is driving you to go find food. And if you eat a bunch of food, it's your hypothalamus that tells you, I'm good, I'm full now. And so your hypothalamus is going to help with those internal urges and drives that we have that allow us to continue to survive. Surrounding the hypothalamus is what we call the thalamus. And I have there integrates senses, which maybe doesn't make a ton of sense. But think of the thalamus almost as a receptionist in an office building. Right? If you walk into an office building, there's a receptionist there that's directing you where you need to go. Go down this hallway, go up that staircase, go down to the basement, whatever. That's kind of like what the thalamus does. As sensory information is entering your brain, different things that you see and hear and smell and taste and feel, it's going to go to the thalamus, and then the thalamus will direct that information to different parts of the brain. So when you see the images on the screen of your computer, the first place those images go is your thalamus, and then your thalamus sends it to the part of the brain that helps us interpret sight. So that's the idea of the thalamus. Basal ganglia, again, a little bit of review here. The basal ganglia helps with fine motor control. So when you are doing things that require precision, right? Buttoning a button, tying a tie, writing with a pen, that's your basal ganglia. Helps with those small movements, implicit memories. Your corpus callosum. I said earlier in this lecture that we have two hemispheres. You got your left hemisphere and your right hemisphere. Your corpus callosum is one of the largest brain structures, and it connects the two hemispheres. It allows the left and right hemisphere to communicate with one another. So it connects and connects the two hemispheres and allows them to communicate. We'll talk a little bit later about what happens when things go wrong with the corpus callosum. And then the last one, we're not going to actually go into a lot of detail of. The last one is the cerebrum. That's this big chunky part of the brain up here. In our next lecture, we'll talk about the cerebrum and kind of divide the cerebrum up. When you think of the brain itself, and when you look at pictures of the brain, you are likely looking at pictures of the cerebrum. And there are a lot of different things that happen in the cerebrum depending on where you're looking. If you're looking at the front of the brain or the back or the sides, there's some different things happening. So just be familiar where the cerebrum is, and we'll talk in some more detail a little bit later about that. Okay, That's a lot of information about the brain in a relatively short amount of time. We will go into more detail on all of these things later, but hopefully that gets you started. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out, everyone. Good luck.